I was born in Scotland in 1718, and I got my medical degree in Paris. This is my graduation portrait, my senior portrait that I had painted, hence the skull on the table. It's a symbol, is actually a common symbol at the time for the fact that I'm a member of the medical profession. Okay? I became quite involved in London society and met a gentleman, Dr. William Duncan, who was the personal physician to King George III. And I got the opportunity to become part of the consular service and spent time in Smyrna, which I will show you where that is in a moment. And I met a young woman in Smyrna, and her name was Maria Gracia du Robin, and she was born to a French family of merchants that were located in Smyrna, and then she got educated in Paris and became involved in Paris society. But back in Smyrna, where we met, is where we got married and started a family. And we had several children early on. She was 17 at the time that we got married. Quite a lovely lady. The other portrait at the bottom there is her later in life. But the first thing I had to do was to find the property that I wanted as part of my land grant. The land grant process was you put forth your application to the government in London. It was approved by the Crown, and then it was sent to the government in St. Augustine. And at this time, in 1764, James Grant had arrived and was governor. And so I arrived in 1766, meet with Governor Grant, and I put forth my application and went to explore. And I explored following. I actually purchased a copy of John Bartram's journal, which I kept a receipt for, because I was going to keep a receipt of every expense, because this is going to be a corporate venture. Okay, this is going to be a money-making venture, so I need to keep all the receipts. So I take John Bartram's journal and I follow his journey all the way down the St. John's River, and then back to St. Augustine, and it's suggested to me that perhaps I head south to the inlet of the mosquitoes. Doesn't sound very appealing, but I went and looked, and I actually found that coming in the mosquito inlet and heading about 3 miles south, the lagoon, or the Hillsborough River, as we called it, took a turn to the west and then a turn to the south and provided this fabulous land. So we had it surveyed, and at this time, Sir William Duncan is a partner of mine, and the two of us put in both of our land grants, and Sir William Duncan's land grant is this one at the bottom, and mine's at the top. And you might recognize some of the geography here as to where we are, but if not, I'll give you a better indication. Here we are. So 20,000 acres each. I bought an additional 300 acres all the way at the top, and this is going to be a fabulous venture. Having been in Egypt and traveling down the Nile, I noticed these fabulous little farms spaced all the way down the Nile. And I thought, what a fabulous opportunity here. What if I create my settlement stretched out along the Hillsborough River with individual little farms spread all the way out. Because I'm not interested in creating a town or a community. I'm interested in the fact that this is a corporate venture and I want very efficient farming sections all along the river. So that is my plan. I want to thank you all for coming to this meeting at the Shakespeare Head Tavern. The pub is still open, so if you need a beer before you leave, an ale, feel free. As we're concluding this meeting, lo and behold, a gentleman, Sir Richard Grenville Temple, approaches me, and he says, my brother George would be very interested in being part of your venture. Now, George Grenville was Prime Minister of England prior to this, so very well connected. Sir William Duncan, personal physician to the King, very well connected. What could go wrong? This is going to be fabulous. So, George Grenville joins in, and it's agreed all around that they will invest £9,000 for this venture, and my investment will be the fact that I'm the on-site manager. Okay? So, I'm now going to head off and recruit the Greek settlers for our venture. So, at this time now, I write to Governor Grant and I say, I'm really excited, things are going great, I've got some people, I'm headed to Smyrna, I want you to start getting things ready in Florida. So in Florida, before I came here, I hired some carpenters, some local craftsmen from the Georgia area colony and from the Carolinas to come down and start building buildings. But then I also purchased 40 African slaves and had them in Florida preparing the land, sawing wood for the carpenters to get everything ready for the 500 settlers that are going to arrive. And I write to Governor Grant at this point, I'm going to be back in time for Christmas. Okay? This is 1767. Okay? I left Florida in May of 1767. I'm now here at the beginning of June, and it's like, I'm going to be home in time for Christmas. So I want you to order salted pork and dried peas and dried corn and have it all shipped to Smyrna to be ready for the 500 settlers to arrive in December. So I traveled to Smyrna to pick up the 500, to attempt to get additional settlers. I run into all sorts of problems, all sorts of obstacles. The weather storms are bad. We're buffeted by the weather coming back. We have to put in for repairs several places along the way. For months we are delayed. Delayed in a most unfortunate manner. We get back to Minorca and we start counting how many settlers we've recruited, and the numbers grow and grow and grow. And so I'm like, how could this have happened? I get back, all of a sudden, the 110 Italian settlers have wives and children. How did that happen? Okay, I had left them there for 8 months on their own. And then, as we're loading the ships, more and more people hearing what we're going to be doing are intrigued, because times have been tough in Minorca, and so they're like, we want to be part of this. And so every time I did a head count, getting ready to leave, we had more people. So we ended up basically with 8 shiploads of people. These are the ships, and these are the number of people on each ship. And by the time we had left Gibraltar, we had 1,403 total settlers recruited. Italians, Greeks, but the majority at this point were Minorcan. So, we leave and we arrive back in St. Augustine, June 26, 1768, is when my ship arrived. And what is today considered landing day in St. Augustine. But 3 ships had arrived earlier ahead of us, and Governor Grant sent them down to Smyrna, New Smyrna, to start preparations. We arrived on the 26th, and 2 other ships would arrive later in Charleston, or Charlestown, as it was called at the time, because they were slower boats and storms had sent them off course. And so it would take a while for them to work their way down, and then the charming Betsy would arrive last. Of the 1,403 who would depart Europe, only 1,255 would survive the crossing. So we end up coming in 1,255 settlers, preparations being made for 500. This was a real concern. And so I actually wrote several letters when I was in, as we were leaving Minorca, as we were in Gibraltar, and from Madeira. Letters at that time, you would have to write a letter in anticipation that you would end up someplace that you could actually send it from, okay? So, and then that letter would sit for a while until it could be put on a ship or given to someone who was traveling in the direction that you wanted the letter to go. So, especially from Florida to London, it would take months. It would take several months for a letter to get there, for them to respond, several months to come back, okay? This was not text messaging, okay? By any stretch. So, from the time I left St. Augustine in May of 1767 until we arrived, that was 19 months. We had spent, at that time, of the 9,000 pound budget, we had spent 14,917 pounds, okay? But I wrote to my investors and I said, look, we have all these extra people that we weren't expecting to have. So what do you want me to do? He was conflicted. And so he said, we have 2 options. He said, I can, if you want, I can sell the contracts of these extra settlers to other plantation owners. Okay? These were indentured servants. They weren't slaves in the sense of them being purchased, but they had contracts that were valuable, okay, that needed to be paid off. So I could sell you a contract for a farmer that will now come and work for you, and then they would have to pay off their debt to you. I've gotten reimbursement for the money I've expended, okay? So he said to the investors, why don't we sell the extra people? But then on the other hand, he says, I've actually grown fond of quite a few of these people. And they're, I believe they're going to be hard workers, and I believe if we keep them all, it's going to be more beneficial for the settlement, and we will reap even greater profits. So it was agreed that they would keep all the settlers. Well, 9 years have passed. and all is lost. Every possible obstacle has been thrown in my way. I have done the best job I know how to do without neglect. My life here is a continual exertion in the service of this settlement. How did this happen? Why did the settlement fail? It's now December 1780, and I am still in St. Augustine. I'm being held under house arrest. I'm being, in May of, the settlement's all broken up. May of 1777, the indentured settlers appeal for release from bondage. 17 settlers provide 21 depositions to the governor. And November 9th, Father Camps reports that the church is now in St. Augustine. May 1780, the Spanish plunder at the Mosquito. What are the Spanish doing in British Florida in 1780? The American Revolution. That is going to throw a wrench into a lot of plans. And December 1780, here I am being sued by my investors. So I talked a little bit about how I wanted to lay out this settlement. And again, the whole concept of this nihilistic approach of laying out individual farms all along the waterway. And you might be able to tell these little red dots all along are individual farmhouses. Okay? We don't have a central town like we had in Europe, where everyone lived together, and then during the day they would go out to their farms, and then at night they would all come back together and have a sense of community. People were spread out, over 8 miles. So if you lived in this house down here on the left, and someone you knew from the old country lived in the house all the way up on the right, you probably very rarely ever saw them. Okay? There was the little central section here. The little central section here was the administrative center of the settlement. It wasn't a town, it was the administrative center. Now, that being said, they built these wooden structures, these wooden barracks. Some of them were for the administrative purposes, some were storage houses. But if you were a single individual, not married, you actually lived in one of the barracks. Okay? If you were a family, you were assigned one of the houses. Now, at the time we arrived, only like 37 houses had been built. Okay? That's a problem. Okay? So, they built these little houses, not enough for 500 people, not enough for the 1,200 people yet, but we had some houses. If you were an overseer, okay, and so we hired additional overseers for the project, some from the northern colonies, and then we had the 3 Italians. They had a larger house. It was a duplex. So one family on the right, one family on the left. This was 17 feet square. Tiny house. If you were a settler, a farmer, you even got a tinier house. It was 14 feet square, but again, it was a duplex. Okay? So one family on the right, one family on the left, central fireplace with a hearth on each side, and then a loft above. Well, what did the other people do? Where did they live? No! No! There was this lack of housing, and so thatched shelters were standard housing for most of the families. They were either a simple lean-to, or perhaps, like the one on the far right, is a sample or an example of a thatched hut that the early native inhabitants of Florida would build. And if you were sort of stuck in this thatched hut, over time, you would expand it and make it bigger and bigger. And so here's another example of a thatched hut in colonial Florida. Not very good during hurricane season. Okay? And that was written about several times, that a hurricane would come through and most of the thatched housing was destroyed and we would have to rebuild. So, everyone arrives in June through the end of July. The last people arrive. August 19th, a rebellion. A rebellion. I had been spending time back and forth between the settlement and St. Augustine, doing administrative work, paying bills. I had been down in New Smyrna to show some of the visitors from the Carolinas what we were doing, and we left. And so Carlo Forni and his other two cohorts had conversations out working in the fields, okay? Because the way the settlement was set up is we broke that 8 miles into 9 different sections of work groups. And each of those 9 divisions were overseen by several overseers. So again, they're out in the fields working. Carlo Forni comes up with this grand idea. Now, a lot of people in the past, and a lot of people through family oral histories, have said that the rebellion was due to the fact that they landed in Florida at the worst possible time. Things weren't really prepared for them. They were very disillusioned, and they felt like they needed to find some way out, okay? But in some of the later research, Carlo Forni hatched a plan with his fellow cohorts that he would offer safe passage to Havana for anyone that wanted to join him, okay? And so they started the rebellion. Once I had left the settlement and went back north, I was gone. People were not in the best of mood, and a ship with supplies had come into New Smyrna to the wharf and was sitting there in the harbor at the wharf. So the 3 things he needed were ready. Ooh. And so he starts this rabble-rousing, and the Italians and the Greeks start to join in, and they start an actual revolt. They break into the warehouses, they get some guns, they start rolling out the barrels of rum, and they take over the ship. Now, Mr. Cutter was the manager of the plantation, of the settlement, and he tries his best to quell the riot, and he gets attacked and is mortally wounded in several areas, and a cow is killed, and in England at the time, that's a capital offense, okay? So there's several things that happen as far as destruction of property. Mr. Cutter is wounded and locked away, and the cow is killed, and they're now trying to get people to agree to leave, and they start drinking the rum and having a good time. But the Menorcans were not going to be part of this. they were appalled at what was going on. And so one Minorcan was able to secret away and send warning, and Governor Grant was able to provide a ship to sail down from St. Augustine and sent some troops over land. And because of the 3 days that they were sort of trying to get everything organized, and you got to remember, you have a sailing ship sitting here. To get to the lagoon, I mean to the inlet, is not easy. You're not in the open ocean, so the wind has to be in the right direction, the tides have to be right, there's all these logistics. It took them 3 days to get out to the inlet, and as they're coming out to the inlet, the ship from St. Augustine comes around and starts to fire upon them. All of the rebels abandon the boat. Several get into canoes or smaller skiffs and try to escape south. Most of them are captured, and about several months later, the ones that had escaped down south were actually captured in the Florida Keys and brought back to stand trial. Now the interesting thing, here's the interesting thing, it sort of came to light that Carlo Forni's real plan was to get as many settlers as possible on that boat, get them to Havana, and then he was going to sell them to the plantation owners in Cuba. So his plan was not so altruistic as far as I'm going to save these settlers. He was trying to make a quick buck. Okay? The 3 of them were put on trial. They were sentenced to hang. One of the convicted individuals was given a reprieve and said, we will commute your sentence, but by the way, you're now the executioner. And so the two men were hanged. About 300 of the other people that had joined in the rebellion brought back to New Smyrna. They suffered a certain level of corporal punishment and then sent back into the fields to work. I felt sort of betrayed by this because I was feeling that I was trying to improve the life of these settlers, and this was a big betrayal. And this corporal punishment sort of now set the tone for the following years, especially by the overseers saw this as, this is the way to keep people in line. So this is the beginning of the mistreatment. But the other things happened. The climate. Worst time of the year to arrive is in June. Who would come to Florida over the summer? Now remember, I had come to Florida to scope things out, was in November and December. It was beautiful here. Nobody told me it was going to be hot and sticky. Okay? Hurricanes, extreme winters. The winter my first winter was actually quite nice here, but the following winters, I'm writing in letters that it's below freezing. We have frost and ice on the ground in New Smyrna. And in 1774, by the time we started getting agricultural production started, severe drought and lack of irrigation, which then we tried to mitigate by digging canals. The agricultural plan, okay, how we were going to make money was indigo, blue gold, an ounce of blue cake dye. These are these chunks I have here are actually broken off from these cakes. They would be weighed, and an ounce was as valuable as an ounce of gold. Okay, but I thought, how else can we make money? So cotton and rice were very common in the Carolinas, so maybe we can do that here. back to indigo, the Carolinas had a fabulous indigo production happening for years, but their problem was they could only grow indigo in the summer. So we thought, being in Florida, we'll be able to grow indigo year-round and make even more money, okay? But the climate did not cooperate. Sugarcane, honey, the honeybee, the honeybee that is here today is not native to the Americas. It was brought here by the Europeans. The Native Americans called honeybees white man flies, okay? Because they had not seen them before, and now all of a sudden, this was something that they had brought to the Americas. So we made honey production here, and we sent honey to England to see if people would be interested in buying it. We were going to plant grapevines. We planted olive trees. We planted fig trees, mulberry trees, okay? Because we were going to do silk production. And cochineal, which is an insect that lives on the prickly pear cactus. Does anyone know what cochineal is?
Dye.
It's a red dye, the British redcoats, okay? It was a very secret process, highly guarded by the Spanish until the secret got out, but it was still a very expensive dye. Fish and oysters. I write back to England that I'm interested in land grants beachside. I want some beachside property because I think the fishing industry here could really be better than the fishing industry in New England. Okay? So I have my eye on that. And naval stores. You know what naval stores are?
Yeah.
Naval stores, hemp for making rope, turpentine, tar, anything that the British Navy needed for their Navy. Okay? But the huge problem became income production, first and foremost, versus subsistence production. We have the 9 divisions, the overseers. They were relentless in saying, there's no time for you to tend your personal garden. Out to the fields, we're growing the indigo. And the investors, looking at this whole other list of things that Turnbull said, we could make money doing all these other things, they were like, stop it. Just stop it, grow indigo. Be done with it. Now at this time, they didn't really know about crop rotation. And so that became a problem of the fields becoming less and less productive and having to allow fields to become fallow. But again, the income production versus subsistence production. There was this huge contrast between the people are starving and he's writing letters to the investors saying, I need money to buy salt pork, corn, and peas from the Carolinas to feed the people because they're starving. But in other letters, he says, you can't believe how many fish we're getting out of the lagoon, and we're salting fish every day. And we have hogs that we're starting to raise, although the hogs are being eaten by the tigers. The Florida panther. Oysters. And again, it's written, the settlers just walk out their front door and there's an abundance of oysters. Okay? And then chickens. They talk about how many chickens are being raised in New Smyrna, and we have so many extra chickens, we're actually selling chickens to the sloop captains that come to New Smyrna, are buying our chickens and taking them north to sell. So there's sort of this dichotomy or this conflict between the people are starving, but look at all of the natural resources that are sitting around us. So, nobody's ever been able to resolve that. But those letters are constant, back and forth. I need to buy food. The people are starving. I need to buy clothing. The people need new clothes. In my contract, every year there's an allowance for you to get cloth to make new clothes. Okay? And we're buying the cloth and the cloth from the northern colonies that have slave plantations raising cotton, and they have slaves then in a weaving industry, and that's how some of the northern colonies are making money, is selling cloth to other people. So we are buying cloth, and the settlers are now making clothing. But as things get worse and worse, and we have less and less money from our investors, I'm having to cut back on somewhere. So in a few years, I'm not buying new cloth. Okay, and that's one of the complaints. I haven't had clothes for 2 years. Now, meaning I haven't gotten new cloth to make new clothes. Health in the settlement was a huge issue in all of the colonies. Scurvy, cholera, typhus, typhoid, etc., etc. All these different maladies. Dr. Turnbull, a medical doctor, tried his best to deal with this, and he writes that we are building a hospital, and one of those 80-foot-long barracks is now dedicated to being a hospital for the settlers. Scurvy was a continuing problem from the voyage across the Atlantic. Scurvy had been, the cure for scurvy had been discovered in about the 1740s by a Scottish doctor, but the British government didn't believe it. And the British government waited until about 1780 to decide to provide citrus to the Navy. Okay? So scurvy was a huge problem. So religion in New Smyrna. The Golden Book of the Menorcans, Father Camps and Bartholomew Casanovas were two Menorcan priests that came over with the settlers. And they were given sort of free rein to take care of the religious needs of the community. And he kept notations on the marriages and the births, and we can assume that he kept notes on the deaths, okay? But the volumes dealing with the deaths have never been found, okay? We have the volumes that deal with marriages and baptisms. So during the years of the settlement, we had 267 baptisms, okay? And Maria Gracia Turnbull and her daughters were actually listed in the church documents as being godparents to some of these children being baptized, okay? Now, the big issue were the deaths. So every year you have men, you have listing the men who died, the women and children who died each year. So by the end of 1777, you add those two together, and then there's a footnote that 34 Greeks died. Well, I'm sure there were other Greeks that died. Who knows what that footnote is. But anyway, you take the men, the women, the children. 964 people died right here. These aren't the people that died at sea. These are the people that died in the settlement. We don't have the books that list who's who, you know, from the church. And we don't have any graves. So, if anyone has any ghost stories, okay, we have 964 ghosts in New Smyrna. And we don't know where. By the way, this is where the church, if you see the top one, the 3 buildings on the right with the letter C, and then in the second map with the letter B, those 3 buildings, That was the church/chapel, and Father Camps writes to the bishop in Havana asking for materials, holy oil. He needs some, a crucifix for the altar. They had brought from Menorca some statues of saints that were in there, and he writes in there, it was a brick church. And there are documents showing where we paid for bricks being imported from the northern colonies. Where's that brick church? It's under somebody's house, okay? It's under somebody's house. And you can see right where, in fact, here's the canal of Canal Street would be right here. So you go further north just a little bit, it's under one of those houses. I'm sure somebody digging up for their garden or whatever, and it's like, oh, these damn bricks. I'm sure there's a pile of bricks behind someone's house that they dug out of their yard. 17 settlers in 1777 come up to St. Augustine and petition to have their contracts released. At first, Tonin is like, I understand, it's not easy, but you need to go back and tend to the fields. So he turns them away. They make a second attempt. This time, he says, 17 of you can stay to give statements. Everybody else go home, and we'll look into it. The settlers these 17 never meet with Patrick Tonin, never meet with the governor. The governor sends for Drayton, who's a friend of Turnbull's, who was the Attorney General of East Florida, but Drayton never responds, so he turns to another lawyer, Yates, to take the depositions. Well, Yates doesn't speak Italian, doesn't speak Greek, doesn't speak Menorcan, okay? So they have a translator, so the Menorcans, the 17 are there issuing their complaints, the translator's translating, Yates, who's a friend of Tonin's, is writing everything down, and then those are then handed to Tonin. Okay, Tonin never meets these 17. Okay, and then Tonin says, "Well, you know what? This is a great opportunity. I don't like Turnbull. I don't trust the Menorcans. You know what? If they come on, let's break up the settlement. Bring them all up here. They'll be in St. Augustine." And the American Revolution's going on, and we need able-bodied men to fight against the 13 colonies. If you were a Menorcan and you were halfway healthy, you were being conscripted to be part of the colonial war. What were those complaints of? Those 17 depositions. We have transcriptions of them all, but I sort of pulled them all together here. Contract dispute. Belief they had been that they had completed the duration of their service. They didn't understand the concept of the first sharing. So we've been here more than 6 years. We should be done. They were promised payment but never saw any money. Some of the contract said you will be paid £5 a year. In addition to the income from the produce, you will get a £5 credit every year. Well, they wanted to see physical money in their hands. I think that money was budgeted in the overall finances, but they never saw physical money. Provisions not provided per terms of the contract, which led to starvation. Inadequate clothing provided. Threats compelling the settlers to agree and sign an extended duration of service. Claims that the contract signatures were forged. And then the abuse of treatment. Charges of laziness or feigning illness leading to physical abuse. Punishment for attempts to forage for food to feed their families. Physical abuse out of anger. The overseers were just brutal. Account of sexual proposition by an overseer. And then extreme corporal punishment. Again, if you got into trouble as a settler, you received lashes, you were put into confinement, and then after confinement, you were required to then go back to the fields wearing chains so that you wouldn't attempt to escape. And then extreme treatment often led to death and some allegations of murder. Now in these depositions, they talked about the overseers being abusive. They talked about Andrew Turnbull being abusive. And in my mind, I'm not making excuses or saying that none of this happened, but if I'm giving a deposition and I say Andrew Turnbull did such and such to me, and then the translator, and then the guy writing it down, how many times was it Andrew Turnbull did this, and it got written down as Dr. Andrew Turnbull did this. So, yes, the Menorcans, the settlers, were abused by the overseers, they were abused by the management, they were abused by Andrew Turnbull, the nephew, and I'm sure there was anger and abuse from Dr. Turnbull out of frustration, but they had enough, they were fed up, and so they were gone. So, 1,255 settlers arrive and begin the largest settlement ever attempted in the Americas. Dr. Andrew Turnbull held fast to his golden dreams. After 9 years of extreme hardship, misfortune, mismanagement, and mistreatment of the settlers, New Smyrna collapsed.